Francisco Franco, absolute ruler over Spain, was one of the most enigmatic dictators in European history. Even today, the country still bears the scars of his reign.
Hitler talks of a 1,000-year Reich. For Franco, that's short-term thinking.
He seized power in a bloody civil war and ruled the country with an iron hand for 40 years.
I mean, even the Germans were shocked and the Italians were shocked at times by the cruelty he showed.
He once said, "I'd have no problem killing half of Spain just to stop it becoming Marxist."
A despot, small in stature, but with a pronounced instinct for power. Even those closest to Franco could rarely fathom him out.
I mean, he says the most mind-bogglingly stupid things you could imagine. And yet, at the same time, he's quite cunning.
In 1975, after Franco's death, Spain was a divided country, the legacy of a dictator full of enigmas. So who exactly was this Francisco Franco? April 1939. 3 years of bloody civil war have claimed 500,000 lives and turned Spain into a different country. Without Hitler's help, Franco would never have come to power. The German bombers of the Condor Legion had enabled the nationalists to emerge victorious. Entire regions lay in ruins. But instead of showing gratitude, Franco infuriated Hitler. At home, the warlord was henpecked. His wife saw to it that her brother-in-law was given positions at the highest level. The unpopular relative pursued his own goals and could have posed a serious threat to the dictator. The emergence of the new regime was marked by subterfuge. Following the success of the coup, Franco was to head the transitional government. His brother Nicholas secretly altered the document appointing him.
What Nicholas Franco did, of course, was that he changed the proclamation at the last moment. And this caused fury with the other generals, because he was supposed to be just the head of the government of the Spanish state for the length of the war.
As this proclamation was going to press, the wording was changed from head of government to head of state. Thus, Franco was automatically appointed head of state.
Zum Staatschef ernannt worden.
Franco was now virtually all-powerful. He had already proclaimed a new beginning months before. In the pose of a statesman, he extended his hand to the whole world.
En la entrada de 1939, la España nacional ofrece a todos los pueblos, con sus glorias y heroicos sacrificios, su voluntad de cooperar a la paz del mundo con su victoria. En la España que forjamos no habrá un hogar sin lumbre ni una familia sin pan.
Franco was not averse to using fine words in his private life either. He would often test the patience of his listeners for hours on end.
Franco in private, when he was with, I say, friends, if one could call them that, was an absolute blabbermouth. You couldn't shut him up. You know, and of course, once he was in power, no one dared to shut him up.
After the Civil War, Spain split into winners and losers, friends and enemies. Whole regions had been devastated. The economy had collapsed. Most people had no idea how they were going to feed their family.
Había hambruna. No hambre. Hambruna.
There was famine,
Hambruna medieval.
just like in the Middle Ages
Hungersnot.
and the 30 Years' War.
Como en la guerra de los 30
People
años.
weren't just hungry, they were
Como en el
starving.
medievo. Hambre,
We're talking about total famine.
pero total.
People collapsed
La gente
and died in the
se desplomaba
streets.
muerta por las calles.
That might sound exaggerated,
Era
but
así.
it is precisely what happened.
Era así.
Franco gave himself the title of Caudillo de España, the political and military leader of Spain. He and his family moved into the El Pardo Palace in Madrid, the former summer residence of the king. Megalomania for all to see.
You don't get to be a dictator if you're normal. You know, you think Hitler was normal, you think Donald Trump's normal. I mean, you know, why aren't you a dictator? You're too normal.
Another expression of power was Franco's exotic bodyguard, the Guardia Mora. This Moroccan elite force underlined the claim to sovereignty over Spain's colonies in Africa. 2 days after his victory, the church also recognized Franco as Spain's leader. He had his dagger blessed to symbolize that he saw himself as defender of the faith. Church leaders had constantly given him their support even during the war, as he went about cleansing the country with violence.
Well, the Spanish Catholic Church had supported, shall we say, the killing of anybody who was basically not Catholic in the earlier periods. We've had the Inquisition during those particular... Only in Spain was the Spanish Inquisition, you know, reintroduced again in the early part of the 19th century. The Spanish Catholic Church was the most reactionary in certainly the whole of Europe.
Franco regarded democracy as dangerous. He had appointed an authoritarian government for conquered regions even during the war. In the summer of 1939, he appointed a second one.
Es un gobierno de
This government represented the most important families of the rebels.
Familias políticas de los sublevados. Están por un lado hay una.
On the one hand, there was a military hegemony. Then there were also the right-wing Catholics, the Carlists, the Phalangists, and a few technocrats.
Están los falangistas y están algunos tecnócratas, esencialmente.
They were all subservient to Franco. His models were the fascist regimes in Italy and Germany, and their leaders, Mussolini and Hitler. In Spain, the so-called Roman salute of the fascists was introduced.
The concept of the Führer, the leader, was adopted from German National Socialism. Franco was the sole source of law. Like Hitler, his will was law. And like Hitler too, he was not subject to any restrictions.
A family member who became a key figure in the new Spain, Ramon Serrano Suñer, the brother-in-law of Franco's wife. She revered the smart lawyer who had just married her sister. Franco was far from happy about Carmen's wish for Ramon to be given political office.
One of the reasons why Franco turned against his brother-in-law was that when Franco was talking rubbish in the family home and Ramon wanted to say anything, Carmen would say, "Paco, just shut up and listen to Ramon, who knows what he's talking about."
The new brother-in-law, Serrano Suñer, was a far-right functionary in the Falange, the Spanish fascist movement. Franco made the Falange, whose members always appeared in blue shirts, the state party.
Serrano Suñer was also much more pro-Nazi than Franco. He'd established close relations with Himmler. He thought that basically in Spain they should imitate many more things of the Nazi party. And in that sense, he was very much closer to the Falange.
Much to Franco's displeasure, ideologically, Spain's fascists were moving ever closer to the German Nazi Party. Despite this, brother-in-law Serrano Suñer soon became his main man.
He assumes the job of trying to create a state, which means trying to create ministries and so on. And this he does very, very well, and he creates for Franco a state.
The restless Serrano Suñer soon controlled the press and the propaganda machine. He liked to go his own way, which later proved to be his undoing. Five months after the Spanish Civil War came to an end, Hitler invaded Poland. It was the start of the Second World War, the beginning of a chain of crimes against humanity. Basically, it was clear on which side Spain stood ideologically, but Franco was reluctant to commit himself.
He did not want to depend too much on the fascist states and on Germany, but at the same time he had to pay back for the Condor Legion, and this is one of the reasons why, again, fish then became such an important part of the Spanish diet for protein, because basically the pigs, the sheep and the cattle were all being shipped off to Germany as part payment for the Condor Legion.
Without the aircraft of the German Condor Legion, Franco's triumph in the Civil War would not have been possible. Hundreds of Spanish towns and villages were bombed. In return for that assistance, Franco was now supplying Germany with raw materials and food, but the Caudillo was not prepared to go any further, at least not officially.
He was cautious because he had to deal with Britain and America, which held control over fuel and food, so that was crucial. But he was desperate to secure help from Germany. He was desperate to help Germany.
Franco was in a fix. He had to pledge strict neutrality. But behind the scenes, he continued to cooperate with Hitler.
Despite its neutral front, Spain was actually the fourth member of the Axis. Germany's secret services operated unhindered in Spain, whereas MI5, MI6 and the Secret Service were kept under close police scrutiny. Spain was no neutral country.
In May and June 1940, German forces conquered the Netherlands, Belgium and France. Franco was faced with a difficult decision. Should he follow Italy's example and enter the war on Hitler's side? Shortly before German troops entered Paris, Franco announced that his country had adopted a new position.
Spain abandoned its neutrality and defined itself as non-belligerent. It was now not actually in the war. However, it had aligned itself with one of the belligerents.
Franco was a brilliant opportunist who was able to cloak himself in the right ideologies to give him the strength that he needed. But as far as he was concerned, power alone was the main question.
Following Germany's victory over France, many Spanish citizens also had to fear for their lives. During the Spanish Civil War, nearly 500,000 had fled to France. Left-wing politicians and intellectuals. They were now in the sights of the Gestapo. In Paris, around 15,000 Spanish exiles were arrested. They were regarded as dangerous communists.
At the beginning of August, the first Spanish nationals were sent to a concentration camp. At the time, there was only one concentration camp outside Germany's old borders. That was Mauthausen in Austria.
Together with his father, José Marfil was also arrested by the SS and deported to Mauthausen. He had fought for the Republic, and in France, he had joined the resistance.
A high-ranking officer arrived and made a speech. "You came in through this door," he said, "but that is how you will leave." And he pointed to one of the chimneys at the crematorium, which had smoke coming from it.
Before the first Spanish nationals were sent to Mauthausen, the German embassy in Madrid had contacted the Spanish government and asked what should be done with their fellow countrymen. Franco's ministries showed no reaction.
Franco was totally indifferent to the fate of Spanish exiles who were sent to Mauthausen or other concentration camps. They were Reds. In his eyes, they were not Spanish, just dirt, scabies. They were of no interest to him.
Nada, no le preocupa nada.
I lost my left eye in a beating. Suddenly everything was white. Things stayed that way for a while. Then the brightness started to fade. But I couldn't see out of my left eye. I pretended to be fine. Had they noticed that something was wrong with me, I'd have gone straight to the crematorium. Other inmates died because the blows to their backs broke their spines.
José Marfil's father was the first Spaniard to die in a concentration camp. By the end of the war, the Nazis had murdered 6,500 Spanish prisoners in Mauthausen alone. Officially, Franco was unwilling to intervene in the war. But after France was defeated, his troops occupied the strategically important region around Tangier.
Franco, once again, was an opportunist in the early period, in particular from 1940 and the collapse of France. He saw the possibility of taking over some of the French provinces or the French territories in North Africa, because he loved the idea of re-establishing the Spanish Empire.
Hitler's next plan was to defeat Britain. If he could succeed in taking Gibraltar, he would virtually control the Mediterranean. A reconnaissance team had already drawn up a plan, Operation Felix. Located at the southern tip of Spain, Gibraltar had been occupied by the British for 300 years. Its fortified naval base was well defended. Hitler planned to attack Gibraltar from the Spanish mainland. All he needed was Franco's permission.
Franco was certainly not keen on the idea of any German troops moving into the Iberian Peninsula in 1940-41, purely because he, out of national pride, the idea of them crossing Spanish territory to take Gibraltar, but also because if Gibraltar was to be taken, he wanted it for himself.
Germany intended to break British resistance with a force of 16,000 troops. But Franco refused to approve the plan. He feared the British. If Spain openly participated in the war, his islands in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean would be threatened.
But he also knew perfectly well that the Allies would retaliate if that was the case, and he knew that they would go for the Canary Islands, and so he would lose the Canary Islands.
Hitler and Franco needed each other, but they never became friends. Their only meeting, in the French border town of Hendaye, was an embarrassing failure. Franco was late in arriving. Hitler had to wait on the platform. When the Spanish leader finally arrived, he cut a surprisingly self-confident figure. He demanded economic aid, arms, and French territories in Africa. But he could not be induced to participate in the war.
Hitler was exasperated with Franco as a result of the meeting at Hendaye. He realized, in fact, that Franco was not going to do anything for him, basically. He was going to do at the absolute minimum and yet try to get as much as he possibly could out of it.
The two dictators conferred for 9 hours. The stubborn Spaniard infuriated Hitler.
Well, of course, Paul Schmidt, Hitler's interpreter, wrote later that Hitler went off very angry, saying he'd rather have 3 teeth pulled out without anaesthetic than have to spend another hour talking to Franco.
The meeting did at least provide Franco with a photograph that would make an impression back home. But the picture was a crude fake. On the original snapshot, Franco had his eyes closed. Now, he had a sovereign look about him. The head from a different photograph had simply been stuck on.
When this picture is compared with other photographs from the original venue, the Franco on the fake is not the Franco who was in Hendaye.
According to a secret protocol, Franco only offered a vague prospect of Spain entering the war, and Hitler did not make any firm promises either.
When the conference was over, Hitler said, "You can't do anything with this man." While Franco reckoned that the Germans are mentally disturbed and have no manners.
Nevertheless, Franco promised to supply the Germans with tungsten, a metal vital to the armaments industry. He also sent the División Azul, the Blue Division, an army of volunteers, to provide support for Hitler's Russian campaign. The idea came from brother-in-law Serrano Suñer.
It was, in a way you could say, it was the least he could do. It was a gesture of support. It got rid of some troublesome elements, some of the more enthusiastic Falangists who wanted to make what they called la revolución pendiente, the pending revolution.
Spain's fascists in the Falange were convinced communist haters. They called for much closer cooperation with Hitler's Germany. Francisco Armengu signed up voluntarily. He had been too young to fight in the Civil War, but now he desperately wanted to join the Blue Division.
When Serrano Suñer said, "It is Russia's fault," I thought, this is my chance. Like many others, I signed up. We also volunteered because we wanted to give the Germans something back, because of their support for Franco in the Civil War.
In 1941, the first 18,000 troops arrived in Germany for basic training.
El primer contacto con una zona de guerra divierte a nuestros camaradas y no divierte menos a los camaradas alemanes que entienden el universal lenguaje de la juventud a través de las alegrías y de las bromas de los españoles, soldados tradicionalmente alegres.
Originally, Franco wanted to send no more than 4,000 troops, but 4 times as many young men signed up. On the military training ground at Grafenwöhr, they practiced for the front in German uniforms. It was a 5-week crash course. Most of the young Spanish soldiers had no military experience whatsoever.
They gave us hand grenades. I got one too. They pulled the pin and I threw the grenade, but it didn't go very far. The sergeant major leapt forward, picked up the grenade and threw it a long way. I didn't have the strength and I hadn't been trained. It was my first hand grenade and it was live.
2 months later, the Spanish troops left for Russia. The Blue Division took part in the attack on Leningrad. At first, the German soldiers made fun of their Spanish comrades, but they were ready for anything.
The German army command to begin with, of course, was very cynical and skeptical because they had not been very impressed from what they'd seen during the Spanish Civil War. But I think they saw them fight very bravely and impressively on the Leningrad front, and so their attitude changed.
In the bitter Russian winter, Franco's troops suffered heavy losses. The Soviet army put up fierce resistance. More than 4,000 Spanish soldiers died in battle or froze to death.
It must have been just before Christmas. The Russians launched 3 major attacks. I was carrying the machine gun. Some distance in front of us, we could see 3 huge snow-covered trees. The Russians had concealed themselves there and were now advancing. They were Mongols or Siberians, high on vodka and clad entirely in white. We drove them back with the machine gun, but after a while, they advanced again. That happened 3 times. Then there was quiet.
In London, Churchill's government was alarmed at Spain's growing support for Hitler. The British feared that Franco would soon openly enter the war on Germany's side. That had to be prevented at all costs, if necessary, even with unorthodox means.
They organized a bribery operation. Franco's brother and a few generals were offered money to dissuade him from entering the war on the side of the Axis powers.
Franco was playing a dangerous game. With his blessing, the German Navy was operating important bases in the Canary Islands. German submarines were refueling in ports in the Spanish group of islands. And in Spain, Hitler's Secret Service was running its biggest agency outside Germany. But since the Civil War, the United States had been supplying Spain with aid. And that was something Franco was unwilling to risk losing.
America, even though they could not in any way support Britain in the fight against Hitler, were able to help keep Franco out of the war by threatening to cut off wheat imports and oil. And that's one of the reasons why Franco could not align himself completely with Hitler.
First and foremost, it was Franco's brother-in-law, Serrano Suñer, who was cultivating relations with Germany. In the eyes of the Spanish military, he was getting too powerful.
In early 1941, he effectively controlled the Ministry of the Interior, the Foreign Ministry, and the Falange. And at that point, the generals started to conspire against him, and they would complain to Franco.
Unlike Franco, Suñer wanted to enter the war at once.
Serrano Suñer was now representing German interests more and more vehemently. In fact, in the end, in May 1941, the Spanish generals who were against the war and were being bribed by the British went to the British and asked them, what if Serrano Suñer were to meet with an accident?
By now, Franco also found that his eager brother-in-law was becoming too powerful. Serrano Suña's enthusiasm for the war was jeopardizing his policy of cautious maneuvering and non-commitment. And that is something no dictator can tolerate.
Franco was never entirely at ease with Serrano Suña and eventually got rid of him at a key moment during the time when the invasion of Russia was taking place in 1941.
A short time later, in the Franco household, the ousted brother-in-law was to make even more enemies. In 1942, a feature film entitled Raza played in Spanish cinemas. It told the story of a family from the 19th century through to the Civil War. The themes were treachery and heroic death, but above all, patriotism. What few people knew was that it was based on a screenplay written along with the production directions by Franco himself under a pseudonym. And indeed, the main character did resemble the dictator.
It's all about himself. It's totally autobiographical. And the hero is clearly himself.
Gracias, Pedro. Pero tú sabes que yo no puedo hacer eso. Ocúpate de estos pequeños.
It's said that he used to watch the film at least once a week and would cry buckets.
In Spain, the foundations of a new state, Franco style, were becoming clear. No constitution, just laws. He had already announced the first one, the Labour Charter as it was known, while the Civil War was still raging.
España cumple en los momentos actuales su destino providencial. Como en otras épocas, derrama ahora su sangre en defensa de la civilización. El trabajo, estimado como el más ineludible de los deberes, será el único exponente de la voluntad popular.
The law promised workers a minimum wage, insurance, and even paid holidays. But first and foremost, it reinforced the rights of entrepreneurs. Wages were dictated by the state, and striking was seen as a serious offense.
Die Sieger haben die Früchte ihres Sieges.
The victors tasted the fruits of their triumph wherever possible. So exploitation continued as before. The big landowners were more brutal and more radical than ever.
In a second fundamental law, Franco proclaimed the creation of the new parliament. Officially, it was to be the supreme representation of the people. In reality, though, it was to be nothing more than a political backdrop, an assembly by the grace of Franco, which at best was allowed to make suggestions to the dictator.
It had no legislative character or function. It merely advised the head of state.
Economic policy was an important pillar in Franco's new state. The aim was for Spain to become independent of the world market, a kind of national self-provider, solely on the basis of Spanish raw materials. Franco even wanted Spain to produce its own armaments and aircraft.
Franco believed that the Spanish nation had to purge itself. And the only way was by cutting out all foreign influences, and that's why Autarky appealed to him, I think, in that particular way. But the suffering was appalling. I mean, the starvation in Spain. Everybody almost was on the brink of semi-starvation, apart from those who were, shall we say, important in the government or business people and so forth.
The crisis reached catastrophic proportions. For many, the propaganda slogan, "No Spaniard without bread," was sheer cynicism. 3 years after the end of the Civil War, for most of the population, hunger was a part of everyday life.
There was simply nothing to eat. And that at a time when my mother was on her own and had 5 children to feed. My school was just around the corner from our house. At break time, they handed out bread and butter and sugar. I always saved what I got for my mother. One day, a teacher noticed this and asked me when I planned to eat it. I explained that I wanted to take it home for my mother. Come with me, he said, and I'll give you some more bread. Eat what you have been given and put the other bread away. That's for your mother.
Franco's economic policy was a total failure. Had it not been for grain imports from America, Spain would have been finished. Many people exchanged their last possessions for food just to survive. Traders became rich. Another law was designed to safeguard Franco's grip on power. Ordinary citizens were banned from engaging in any form of political activity. Trade unionists and members of the old parties were suspected of being insurgents. They had to fear for their lives.
Franco no longer engaged in politics. He was pursuing a divine plan. Preliminary proceedings were held in which verdicts were passed before people had barely taken their seats. You either got no lawyer at all, or a member of the Frankist military, who was totally biased anyway.
Retroactively, Franco had everyone punished who, as he put it, had disturbed the social peace. By that, he meant all supporters of the former republic, politicians, writers and teachers. Any opposition was to be nipped in the bud, for the good of the nation.
When Franco says Spain, and this goes on right till the day he dies, he doesn't mean Spain in the way you mean it or I mean it. He doesn't mean all of the country. He means those who think like we do.
It was the start of a reign of terror. More than 170 concentration camps were built to re-educate alleged enemies of the state. Franco's campaign against real and presumed opponents continued, with mass arrests and executions.
In the years after the Civil War, Franco himself always spoke of victory. He never talked of peace. 1939 was declared the Año de la Victoria, the year of victory. To a certain extent, it was supposed to mark the start of a new era.
Spain needed workers for reconstruction. Political prisoners had to do forced labor on building sites or in factories loyal to the regime. In this way, some were able to shorten their sentences and avoid execution. Tens of thousands were sent to work in the Valle de los Caídos, the Valley of the Fallen. Northwest of Madrid, in the mountains of the Sierra de Guadarrama, they cut a huge basilica out of the rock. A monument to the 30,000 nationalist dead, and a mausoleum for the deceased founder of the fascist Falange movement, and possibly for Franco himself. Towering over it is a stone cross, 150 meters high.
I think it was the same as the pharaohs in Egypt had when they built the pyramids. It was a great personal, the monument that, as Franco himself said, would challenge history throughout the ages. part of his ego.
The gangs of convicts worked on the mausoleum for nearly 20 years, and Franco's propaganda tirelessly vaunted the construction as an act of reconciliation. But his politics told a different tale. In particular, regions with their own marked identity were subject to massive oppression. Franco even banned the Basque and Catalan languages.
I once asked a friend something who was sitting next to me at the table. I didn't notice that a teacher was standing behind us. He immediately threw me out of the classroom and made me stay there. Here we speak Spanish, he said.
Yet, despite all the terror, there were rumblings in Franco's realm. Serrano Suñer and his fascist hardliners were lining up against the dictator. At the same time, monarchists were calling for the restoration of the royal house, as Franco had promised after the Civil War. The dictator removed his fiercest critics from office. He ousted his brother-in-law, Serrano Suñer, from the last of the political posts he still held. This move, it seems, was also prompted by Franco's wife Carmen, because Suñer was cheating on her sister.
It then turned out that Serrano Suñer, who was something of a ladies' man, was having an affair with the wife of a Spanish aristocrat. And Mrs. Franco was furious about this. There were complaints, and Doña Carmen had now become his bitterest enemy. And that led in early 1942 to him getting the sack, basically.
On the foreign policy front, Franco's delaying tactics paid off, because in the Second World War, things were changing. The Allies had landed in North Africa, virtually off the Spanish coast. And after Stalingrad, Hitler's Russian campaign was on the brink of failure. Franco's Blue Division, his División Azul, was still fighting for Germany. But the Caudillo needed to send a signal.
First, the American ambassador, Carlton Hayes, went to see Franco. So too did British Ambassador Samuel Hoare, who told him, "Excellency, in view of the current situation, one should perhaps consider the possibility of repatriating the División Azul." And indeed, on October the 12th, after exactly 2 years, the División Azul left the front.
Franco had sent nearly 48,000 troops to the Eastern Front. More than 4,000 had died, and hundreds would spend years as Soviet prisoners of war.
Franco broke up the Blue Division partly because he had quite a good instinct and a nose for seeing that the war was changing, that the Germans were losing their advantage, losing the momentum of their attack. And basically, with America in the war from December 1941, geopolitically, there was no way that the Axis, that the Germans and the Italians, could ever win the war.
When the first troops returned from the war, Madrid had celebrated its heroes. Now, no one cheered.
When they came back in 1943, there were practically no official receptions. Those who had gone to Grafenwöhr in Bavaria to fight as heroes returned 2 years later in total silence. The country no longer wanted anything to do with the Blue Division.
Franco,
since he was regarded as politically neutral, Franco had to cancel the big welcome home celebrations. All the others returned almost unnoticed. I was lucky to be one of the first homecomers.
After the celebration, we stayed for a while. Then we took off our uniforms and handed them back. We collected our passports and went home.
The Western powers kept a close watch on Spain to see how clearly it would disassociate itself from Nazi Germany, because Franco too had railed against the alleged world Jewish conspiracy.
And the idea was that, the Jews were the capitalists in New York, but they also controlled the left because they were also the communists in Moscow. I mean, lunacy, but Franco believed it.
From 1942, Hitler's genocide of the Jews meant that Franco's regime was faced with some difficult questions. Because, like here in the Balkans, Sephardi Jews lived all over Europe, the descendants of Jews who had been expelled from Spain in the 15th century. Later, they were allowed to have Spanish citizenship again, so they were actually under Franco's protection.
Franco must have realized that the policy of total annihilation had started in December 1942, when the Allied nations of the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States condemned the Nazi regime for the Holocaust and threatened their reprisals at the end of the war. So Franco was clear from that particular point.
Spanish Jews all over Europe tried to escape the Holocaust and flee to their old homeland. Franco could have saved many of them, but he hesitated.
The truth of the matter was that there were individual diplomatic representatives in different countries, particularly in Hungary and Romania, who went to enormous trouble and went through danger to help Jews, and that's absolutely true. But that's nothing to do with Franco or the regime. Franco himself, who until very late was using a lot of anti-Semitic rhetoric, did nothing.
Over 50,000 Spanish Jews from France and Greece alone were deported by the Germans and murdered. Yet, until well after the war, Franco had himself feted as a savior of the Jews. And indeed, he did allow thousands of Jews transit through Spain, but only those who were going to leave straight away, for Britain or the United States, were granted an entry visa.
For as far as Franco was concerned, it was quite a good gesture to try and show a little bit of humanity without any risk to himself.
Jews from all over Europe hoped to escape through Spain. At the border, they had to surrender most of their possessions. But in this way, almost 50,000 managed to flee from the Nazis.
Even internal investigations carried out later in Spain admit that we could have saved many more Jews if we'd wanted to, or not been so hesitant.
June the 6th, 1944. In Normandy, in northern France, the Americans, the British, and their allies began their liberation of Europe. There was now hardly any doubt that Nazi Germany would lose the war. Franco's hesitation in not openly entering the war on Hitler's side was now paying off.
Franco's behavior in World War II was completely self-interested, self-centered, only looking at it from a purely Spanish point of view. And from that point of view, he managed to keep Spain out of the war. Spain would not have survived if it had had to fight at that particular stage because of basically economic and even food resources, to say nothing of the military aspect.
In April 1945, Soviet troops took Berlin. Hitler committed suicide and his reign of terror came to an end. The defenders in the final battle for Berlin also included Spanish fascists. Although Franco had long since disbanded the Blue Division, it was their personal decision to fight on for their illusion.
lots of them stayed till the very end. I mean, there were Spaniards were defending the chancellery in Berlin at the very end.
Franco had managed to contain the warmongers in his own ranks. Consequently, his regime had survived the Second World War virtually intact. Franco, the shrewd player who aimed to please everyone, while constantly concealing his true colours.
Franco wanting to be almost like a sphinx, so nobody could actually identify what his real political opinions were. This was certainly the case before the coup, before the rising in Spain in 1936, and it was very much the case later on. Nobody could really pin down exactly what he thought on certain cases. And from that point of view, it was a tremendous advantage to him.
No one at the time suspected that Spain still had 30 years of Franco's dictatorship ahead of it. The unfathomable despot profited first and foremost from external circumstances and from a boundless feeling for power.
In 1945, Franco is saying, don't worry, Hitler is tempting in the Russians, tempting in the Americans, and when he's got them in, he will unleash the Wunderwaffen and he will destroy them. And you think, this guy, I mean, he says the most mind-bogglingly stupid things you could imagine. And yet, at the same time, he's quite cunning. And that is a real conundrum. It's a real problem for a biographer.
Franco took every possible step, internally to eliminate his enemies, and externally to suddenly appear as a reliable partner of the West. Many Spaniards would benefit from this tactic, but far more would suffer under the shackles of the dictatorship.